Okay, perfect. Good morning, everyone. I'm Margaret Scott. I'm a forester with Westwind Forest Stewardship, and I've been a forester in the area since 2017. Just to give you a bit of background on who Westwind Forest Stewardship is, we hold the Sustainable Forest License for the French Severn Forest. So we do the Crown Land forest management. So we don't do anything on private or parkland. The French Severn Forest is roughly from Algonquin Park to Georgian Bay, from the French River down to the Severn River. So roughly that area is the Crown land that we manage. So we don't do any harvesting or anything like that ourselves. We hold about 23 overlapping licenses with operators who do the harvesting. So we're responsible for the planting, overseeing the planting, the tending, planning activities, compliance, as well as reporting, ensuring that we're managing the forest sustainably. Something that makes Westwind kind of unique is that we're the first large public forest to be certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. And that was back in 2002. Another thing that makes us unique is that we're a not-for-profit community-based organization. So we have industry, community, and Indigenous representation on our board. But into the forest pests, the first one I want to talk about is forest tent caterpillar, because it was getting quite a bit of attention in Ontario a few years ago. Forest tent caterpillar is native to North America and attacks primarily trembling aspen, oak, ash, maple, and white birch. It does have regular outbreaks in Ontario about every 10 to 12 years. And you can see on the graph these large outbreaks by hectares of moderate to severe defoliation starting in 1950. And you can see that they kind of happen on a regular basis. And a few years ago, predictably, we had a bit of an outbreak. These outbreaks typically last from 3 to 6 years in an area. Mature forest tent caterpillars are about 5 centimeters long. They're hairy, dark brown, and have a blue stripe along each side of their body. So this was the one we were looking at in that initial trivia. And you can see in the photo that they also have a row of white keyhole-shaped spots along the center of the back. And this is a key thing, I guess pun intended, to look for when trying to identify the caterpillar. So those little white spots that kind of look like a keyhole. Forest tent caterpillars feed on the leaves of the hardwood trees. In the early part of the season, they eat leaves near the top of the tree, and then they move toward the inner and lower leaves. Trees can withstand infestations relatively well. However, longer infestations can result in less growth and potential death in some of the branches. Trees can eventually die, particularly if they're suffering from another form of stress, such as maybe another pest or a weather event or something like that. If you look at the left side of the map, let me just get my cursor here. This is the French Severn Forest. I don't know how well people can see this. So the Parry Sound District. You can see that we have a fair amount of moderate to severe defoliation caused by the forest tent caterpillar starting in 2017 in this area. Again, looking at that same area, this continued into 2018, kind of a line along parallel to Georgian Bay there. However, by 2019, when we zoom into our region, the population had largely collapsed and areas of defoliation were far fewer and more isolated. You may have seen defoliated trees in our region in 2019, but most of this was caused by Gypsy Moth, which I'll talk about later. Like the chart I showed with the peaks of forest tent caterpillars, we will expect to see future outbreaks of forest tent caterpillar in Ontario as well as in our region. Thankfully, because forest tent caterpillar is native, it does have natural control mechanisms. After a year or two of the outbreak, parasites and diseases begin to control the infestation. A virus kills many young caterpillars and actually affects the dispersal and reproductive ability of female moths. Parasites such as flies and wasps also help to control these infestations. Oops. Despite these natural controls, if you would like to do something yourself, you can check trees in the late winter and early spring for egg bands, and you can remove these. However, it should be noted that other caterpillars can infest trees even after these egg bands have been removed. And actually, the caterpillars can also be removed by hand or by spraying them with water when they get to that stage. Finally, there are insecticides that can be sprayed against the forest tent caterpillar, such as BTK. And it's important to consult a forestry professional when dealing with or considering pesticides. Okay, so this kind of goes back to the trivia question, just to keep things interesting. Forest tent caterpillar can also be confused with eastern tent caterpillar. The eastern tent caterpillar is also native, but is not really considered a major pest, and the defoliation from it often causes little permanent damage. So even though both these guys are called tent caterpillars, the forest tent caterpillar doesn't actually make a tent, while the eastern tent caterpillar does. And the eastern tent caterpillar is hairy and a similar length to the forest tent caterpillar, so it's understandable why they get confused, but you can tell it apart by the white line down its back instead of those keyholes. You can also keep an eye out for their silken tents in branches. The next pest I kind of wanted to talk about is emerald ash borer, or EAB, as it's often called, which is an invasive beetle that has been found to attack most species of ash. It is native to East Asia, including areas in China and the Russian Far East. It was first detected in Windsor in 2002, but has since been found in southern Ontario, Quebec, Thunder Bay, and Sault Ste. Marie. EAB was found near Gravenhurst and Bracebridge in 2018 and in Killbear Provincial Park in 2019. As well, the MNRF has also confirmed it in Port Severn, Bala, Perry Island, and Perry Sound. It's important to note, though, that this is just the confirmation that it's here and does not necessarily tell us how widespread it is at this point. When identifying emerald ash borer, an important part of that is identifying ash trees themselves. On mature trees, bark is tight and displays patterns of diamond-shaped ridges. So as you can see in the picture on the left, you kind of see these diamond ridges in the tree, and that's a great way to identify ash. Unfortunately, on the young trees, the bark is relatively smooth, so it's more difficult to identify. The leaves contain 5 to 11 leaflets with smooth or toothed margins. So what you can see here is this whole thing on the right, this whole leaf, is considered one leaf, and then those smaller things that most people would call leaves are actually leaflets. And the neat thing about them is the leaflets are positioned opposite with one at the top. So each of those leaves has kind of a buddy across from it, except for the top one. When seeds are present, they're oar-shaped and usually hang in clusters. Branches and buds are considered opposite as well. So that means they're directly across from each other rather than staggered. And if some branches are missing, it may appear that not every branch kind of has that pair across from it. But you can still look for the opposite branching overall. And the nice thing about this is not many trees have opposite branching. A lot of them are alternate, so they're kind of staggered. Those that do include ashes, maples, dogwood, and horse chestnut. Now that we've identified the ash tree, how do you identify the emerald ash borer itself? The adults have elongated bodies that are metallic green. So that's really nice, emerald ash borer, metallic green, and are about 1 to 1.5 centimeters long. They have black eyes and a flat head. And then on the right, you can see the larvae, which is a creamy white with 10 bell-shaped abdominal segments. And when fully mature, they're around 3 centimeters long. And this actually goes through 4 growth stages to get to that point. Those metallic green adults come out in June and July and then lay their eggs on the bark of ash trees. After the egg hatches, the larvae burrow into the inner bark and cambial layer, and they feed on the tissue, and they create these feeding galleries. Larva then excavates a tiny chamber that it will stay inside during the winter. And then finally it pupates or develops into an adult in April and May before the cycle starts again. The galleries that the borer create girdle the tree, which means they cut off the flow of water and nutrients. And this can result in kind of dieback, which is kind of the death of some of the branches or leaves of the tree as it dies from the top down. The leaves may also turn yellow or wilt. And these feeding galleries can also cause bark cracks that are about 7 to 10 centimeters long. Because woodpeckers feed on the larvae, You can also look for increased woodpecker damage. However, woodpeckers obviously are going to show damage on a lot of trees for a lot of different reasons, so this alone isn't necessarily a good indicator of EAB. The adult borers emerge from distinctly D-shaped holes that are about 4 millimeters across. So they are small, but as you can see in the top photo here, you have kind of that flat top to the hole that they're coming out of, and then the curve at the bottom kind of forming that D. Finally, if you notice signs of infestation and remove some of the bark from the tree, you will see those S-shaped galleries that the larva created. By the time signs and symptoms of the attack are visible, trees have usually been infected for about 3 to 4 years. Because of this, it is important to try to detect emerald ash borer early. This is actually what the Muskoka Conservancy and partners started in 2015 using prism traps and lures. In 2018, they found 1 EAB at a site near Bracebridge and 1 at a site near Gravenhurst. And then in 2019, they found 29 emerald ash borers at 2 sites near Gravenhurst. Unfortunately, the program was put on hold due to COVID in 2020, but they're hoping to start that up again. And as I mentioned earlier, MNRF has also confirmed the presence of EAB near Parry Sound, Bala, and Port Severn. Once there is an established EAB infestation, there are really only 2 main options for urban trees: insecticide treatment or cutting down the tree. Triazine is the main insecticide being used to control EAB. Is injected under a tree's bark and moves upward with the flow of water and nutrients. It is applied between May and August, and since it is a pesticide, it must be applied by a licensed professional. Triazine can be effective at controlling EAB for up to 2 years. However, some areas are recommending that at the peak of infestation, it's applied every year. So you can see this professional here inserting that pesticide into the tree. Although this can be a great option, it's important to consider what trees are ideal for this treatment. First of all, it might seem obvious, but it's important that they are in an area with EAB or it's not necessary. The tree should have good overall health and be structurally sound to ensure that it's worth treating. Triazine is usually applied to trees which would be difficult or expensive to remove or have significant value to you. So that can mean kind of whatever you consider a valuable tree might be one that you want to consider treatment. Treatment can unfortunately get costly depending on the size of the ash tree. So that's why you want to really consider what trees you're treating and which you're not. Another option, of course, is to remove trees. This is especially important if a tree is declining as a result of EAB and poses a risk to people or property. If you're concerned about a tree, it's best to consult a forestry professional such as an arborist. Depending on where you live, some municipalities also have tree cutting bylaws or permits, so it's best to check that before cutting down a tree. Once the tree is cut, it's also important that the wood is not moved out of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulated area, which is actually quite a big area, so it's really just a best practice to not move it very far. So speaking of removing trees, Killbear Provincial Park had to remove a significant number of trees over the past couple of years due to the outbreak that they found in 2019. The 2 main clusters were campgrounds that were about 3 kilometers apart, and they estimate that they cut around 7,000 trees that could fall on a road or a campsite. So although many were not necessarily hazardous at this stage, it was decided to cut them down preemptively for safety. And there were about 70 campsites that were closed for the 2020 season, as there were still ash trees that were not cut. And this photo here was actually taken at Killbear in 2019, which shows an emerald ash borer and then those galleries in the tree. So we are starting to see the impacts of emerald ash borer in certain places in our region. When we're talking about larger areas and woodlots, there are more management options. Although it might seem like you do not need to remove all ash trees. Instead, it's important to encourage diversity in the woodlot by promoting other species and potentially reducing the ash component if you have a large ash component. If you're thinning your woodlot, focus on removing poor quality stems of all species, aside from those that you're keeping for wildlife, of course. And depending on your goal for your woodlot, ash trees will retain timber value for a time after initial attack, around 3 to 5 years. A forestry professional can help you make these decisions and will take into account the long-term goals and sustainability of your woodlot. Again, it's important to ensure that if you're cutting down ash, you're not moving it outside of the regulated area so that we're not spreading it to other places. Okay, European gypsy moth. Obviously, a lot of folks are dealing with that right now. It's concerning for some people. So we'll talk a bit more about that. European gypsy moth is an invasive pest that defoliates trees. The gypsy moth we see in our region is the European gypsy moth, which is found in many areas of Eastern Canada. The Asian gypsy moth is not known to occur in North America, although introductions of the insect have been detected and eradicated. So the European gypsy moth was first introduced to North America in the 1860s in hopes of crossbreeding it with North American silkworm for the silk industry. Unfortunately, this did not work, and it was accidentally introduced into the wild in Massachusetts. And it was eventually detected in Ontario for the first time in 1969. So a bit of a failed experiment there. And now we have the gypsy moth that we do. Here's a great diagram of the life cycle of the gypsy moth. And I'll go into each of these stages more, so no need to kind of pick up all this information at once. Right now, the gypsy moth is in most places around here in the caterpillar stage. However, a month or two ago, it was in that egg stage. So the eggs are actually laid in August and overwinter in this stage until April. In the spring, the eggs hatch and the larvae or caterpillars feed on the new foliage. They then pupate in cocoons in mid to late July. And then finally in late July and early August, the adult moths emerge. In order to better identify the gypsy moth, I want to discuss each of these stages. And also it's important to note that each of these stages is going to differ slightly depending on where you are, how far south you are. And even I've seen different stages very close to each other. So some of those eggs just hatched a little bit earlier. So in the spring, these eggs hatch into larvae or caterpillars. The caterpillars begin feeding on the leaves. The egg masses can be found on tree trunks, bark, or other hard surfaces like furniture or wood. They're tan colored and can have almost a fuzzy appearance. When egg masses overwinter, they can appear to have a more cream white coloring. And size-wise, the egg masses are usually 2 to 8 centimeters long. The concerning part is even in this tiny area, they can contain 100 to 1,000 eggs. And once in the spring they do hatch, the caterpillars begin feeding on the leaves. And these larvae have 5 to 6 growth stages where they shed their skin and get bigger. And the later stages, when the caterpillar is more mature, can be identified more easily. And this is by the 5 pairs of blue dots and the 6 pair of red dots on their back. And they're about 5 to 7 centimeters long. And this is the stage that causes defoliation to trees. So this is when they're eating the leaves, is at the caterpillar stage. The pupae or cocoon is dark brown with white to yellow hairs. Once the adults emerge, these are left behind. And I was on a local trail recently, and you could see the pupae from last year's gypsy moth, and on trees from this year where there's gypsy moth, you can see some of those ones from last year as well. Finally, we get to the adult gypsy moth. So the adult moths do not feed on anything, and their only purpose is to reproduce. The female is larger cream or white colored moth in the photo, and you see it has brown or black dots on the wingtips. The male, on the other hand, is smaller brown moth, has distinctive wave-like patterns on its wing, and interestingly enough, the female cannot fly and gives off pheromones to attract the male who can fly. The gypsy moth prefers oak trees, but actually has over 300 plant hosts, including maple, birch, white pine, and white spruce. A single caterpillar can eat up to 1 meter square of leaves in its lifetime, so that's just one season. Although this defoliation can look very harmful, many healthy trees can tolerate 1 or more years of defoliation, and some trees will actually reflush with leaves later in the summer once the caterpillars are gone. Unfortunately, this does take a lot of energy from the tree, and there's not much time left in the season to regain that energy through photosynthesis. But still, healthy trees are often able to handle 1 or more years of defoliation. A combination of stresses such as diseases, other pests, droughts, or prolonged defoliation over many years can lead to tree death or mortality. So if a tree is already unhealthy, it may not do as well as a healthy tree against gypsy moth. Gypsy moth is not new to Ontario, though. Even though it is an invasive species, gypsy moth has kind of reached a state of naturalization. This means that the population may have periodic, predictable outbreaks, and it's predicted that gypsy moth will have an outbreak about every 7 to 10 years. However, in this area, we have not had an outbreak since the early 90s. We have had some minor localized increases, but no true outbreaks. So it was kind of expected that there would be another outbreak at some point. And although we saw a small increase in defoliated area locally in 2019 and then a greater increase in 2020, it is hard to predict when a local outbreak would happen, whether it'll be this year or next. And when we compare our area to other parts of Ontario, we certainly did not have near the amount of defoliation that other regions saw in 2020. So let's go back to 2018 to see how this has progressed provincially. So these maps show areas of defoliation caused by the gypsy moth. Moderate to severe defoliation is in red, and then light defoliation is in yellow. You can see in 2018 that there was some defoliation in southern Ontario, which expanded in 2019 to cover more area. So you can see it kind of working its way up in a few isolated spots, even up in Parry Sound. Last year, there was even more spread of defoliation in southern Ontario, and particularly bad areas as you get closer to eastern Ontario. You can see some smaller areas of defoliation in the Parry Sound district, which I will zoom in on. So here's a close-up of the French Severn Forest, also known as the Parry Sound district, like we discussed earlier. In this map provided by the MNRF, 2019 gypsy moth defoliation is shown in blue, and 2020 defoliation is shown in red. So in 2019, we had 177 hectares of defoliation mapped compared to in 2020 when we had 2,046 hectares. Although I can't speak to the entire region, certainly I can say that locally in Parry Sound, we do have plenty of gypsy moths this year, I'm sure, as people have seen. And I think we're also hearing that from other areas, but it's unclear exactly how many we have and how widespread it is. Thankfully, when it comes to gypsy moth, it's not all doom and gloom. There are natural controls, including a fungus, a virus, and predators that usually help to control populations of gypsy moth back to more manageable levels 1 to 3 years after the outbreak. There are parasites, wasps, and other predators that can feed on various stages of the gypsy moth. So a fungus from Japan introduced to North America causes widespread mortality of gypsy moth caterpillars. It has a greater effect when there's a cool, wet spring. So unfortunately, recently, we haven't quite been getting that. So it'll be interesting to see whether we start to see signs of that fungus. The dead caterpillars are brittle and dry, as seen in the photo on the left, and eventually drop to the ground. So the photo on the left of kind of that, it gets skinny, it's brittle and dry. We showed it in the trivia question. That's been impacted by the fungus. The Npv virus is a virus which only affects gypsy moth and kills the gypsy moth. It occurs naturally, but only in large populations. So as you can see in the photo on the right, caterpillars infected with the virus look like an inverted V. This is a bit gross, but the virus liquefies the inside of the caterpillar, which leaks. Other caterpillars crawl across it and become infected. While doing surveys, the MNRF did find larvae in Ontario that showed these signs of the virus. And the egg masses are cold tolerant down to -20 or -25 degrees in the winter. But if the temperature gets below there, they can start to cause egg mass mortality. Unfortunately, if the egg masses are below the snow, they do have a higher likelihood of survival. While waiting for these natural mechanisms to control the population, there are some control options that folks may choose to use. So the first option is to scrape the egg masses off surfaces and kill them. At this point right now, there's probably not a ton of egg masses that haven't hatched on your tree. However, there may be some. So this could be an option if there's kind of any stragglers that are still on the tree. So egg masses can be found and removed from a variety of surfaces. Remember that the caterpillars will start emerging in May, so you want to do this before it happens. With a butter knife or a plastic paint scraper, scrape the egg masses into soapy water and leave it for 48 hours before disposing them. Caterpillars can still emerge from egg masses that fall to the ground, so just make sure you're getting them in the soapy water. European gypsy moth caterpillars have long hairs that can cause skin irritation or allergic reactions for some people, so it's best to always wear gloves when you're going to handle them. Once the caterpillars emerge, you can remove them by hand picking them off the tree. This is made much easier by applying a burlap wrap. A burlap wrap is done by wrapping a piece of burlap around the stem of the tree, tie a piece of twine or rope around the center of the burlap, and drape the burlap over the rope so there's an overhang. You can see that in kind of the series of photos there. These caterpillars will seek shelter from predators and heat during the day by crawling into the overhanging burlap. You can check that burlap in the afternoon and pick off the caterpillars. Once you've picked off the caterpillars, you can put them in soapy water to destroy them. Again, I've heard of a lot of people having allergic reactions to them recently, so just make sure you are wearing gloves when touching them and just be careful. And those cocoons we were looking at earlier, you can hand pick those off as well. There are also pesticide options. The most common is a biological pesticide called BTK. It's a naturally occurring bacteria found in soil that can be applied to the foliage of trees. The caterpillars must ingest the pesticide in order for it to be effective, so it can't just be sprayed on top of them. They have to eat the leaf that was sprayed. The timing of application is particularly important and must be done in the early stage of caterpillar development when caterpillars are beginning to feed on foliage. Application timing is also important to ensure that BTK does not affect other Lepidoptera species, such as butterflies and moths. Affecting non-target species is a fairly common concern, that other Lepidoptera species could also be actively feeding while sharing the same time and space. This risk is low since gypsy moth is treated at about 50% leaf out and in a forest setting and generally not around water. So there are a few Lepidoptera species getting indirectly treated. BTK breaks down on the leaves in about 48 hours. Although BTK can help to reduce the population to more manageable levels, it does not eradicate all gypsy moth insects. It should be applied by a registered pesticide application company or by homeowners who have thoroughly and carefully read application instructions. For larger scale projects, only certified pesticide application companies should apply it. An aerial spray of BTK is being done this year by some landowners and organizations in some of the more harder hit areas of the province. The triazine that I talked about earlier for emerald ash borer is also an option for protecting trees from gypsy moth. Again, back to this chart, which I love, not only shows the life cycle of the gypsy moth, but also when different control measures are appropriate. When using physical removal of gypsy moth, there may be limits to how many trees you can treat. So in this case, similar to choosing trees to protect from EAB, you want to protect trees based on what is important to you. That could mean trees close to your house, unique species, trees with special habitat, trees that might be difficult to replace, or any other reason that might make them a priority for your management objectives. Beech bark disease is another forest health concern we have in our region. It's caused by an insect fungus complex consisting of a scale insect and a neonectria canker fungus. The scale insect feeds on the bark and makes the tree vulnerable to that fungus. The scale insect was first introduced from Europe in the 1890s near Halifax. In the 1930s, tree death from beech bark disease was observed in the Maritimes. And then in 2010, we had it confirmed here in the Muskoka area near Baysville. Part of identifying beech bark disease is identifying beech trees themselves. You can see an example of their leaves in the photo, but one of the most obvious signs is the smooth gray bark that we often say kind of looks like elephant skin, so we call it elephant bark. Kids are specifically great at finding beech bark. The scale insect, which is the first sign of the disease, is very tiny. It's only about 1 millimeter long, and they have white woolly wax covering on their body. So you see kind of this like white woolly texture, but they're very, very small. So people will often see kind of larger patches of lichen and wonder if that's beech bark disease. The scale is quite small and can be difficult to see until kind of a bit more of an infestation has built up and you see more of them on the tree. You can see the scale insects behind the leaves in the picture on the left. Once the fungus moves in, it produces red fruiting bodies on the bark, and those are easiest to see in the fall. There's 3 stages of beech bark disease. The first is the advancing front, which is characterized by the arrival and colonization of scale insect alone. Scale insects themselves normally do not inflict that much harm to the tree, but they do make the tree vulnerable to that fungus coming in. The next stage is the killing front, characterized by the rapid buildup of scale infestation, canker fungus infection, and canker development. So this results in heavy levels of beech tree death. Reports of lag time between that scale infestation and the appearance of fungal infection range from about 2 to 10 years. But it seems we have a short time frame from advancing to killing in the Muskoka area, closer to that 2 years. And we are well into this stage in some parts of our region, including Dorset, Baysville, Killbear, and beyond. The last stage is the aftermath forest. After the first wave of tree death, remaining beech trees gradually decline. Younger trees become infected and decline over time as well. There are more understory beech trees growing from the roots of the diseased older trees. Thankfully, we are not at this stage in our region, except for some pockets here and there. You might be wondering, well, surely it's not all beech. There are reports of some beech being resistant to the scale insect. Some state 1 to 4%, but we are not totally sure of that. Part of the issue is that we can't really tell whether a tree is resistant until we get to the aftermath forest. Some may just experience the disease later, or if they're still living in the aftermath forest, it is possible they're resistant or tolerant if they survive beyond the other trees. Another symptom of beech bark disease is sprouting of beech regeneration. When the mature trees die, many sprouts of new trees are sent up from their roots. So this is one of the main ways that beech trees regenerate. They send up shoots from the roots of the existing trees. This provides a fairly dense shade on the forest floor and makes it difficult for other species to thrive. This is a problem for biodiversity as species like maple and birch get shaded out, while beech, which will likely be susceptible to beech bark disease, will become the dominant species. At Westwind, we're doing some work with controlling this beech regeneration in order to promote other species in our forest and have more of a diverse, healthy forest going forward. Unfortunately, there aren't a ton of great control option when it comes to beech bark disease, but for trees that might have that higher value to you, you could try a combination of insecticidal soap and removing scale insects with a power washer. This may help to mitigate some future infections. Trees that do have beech bark disease and are near homes or recreational areas can be hazardous. One of the reasons for this is these weakened trees can be prone to breaking over in windy conditions, which is specifically referred to as beech snap. And this is not always predictable, so it is a good idea to remove trees that are potentially hazardous before they die or fall naturally, just for safety. Beech is, of course, an important tree for wildlife, as beech nuts are high in protein and fat for many animals, including bears. You'll actually see bear claw marks on a lot of beech trees because bears climb up to get those beech nuts. For this reason, we try to keep some select trees in the forest that have not yet been infected in hopes that they will continue to provide food, and potentially, maybe some of them will be resistant, although we're not necessarily banking on that. Now that we've talked about some of the forest pests affecting our local area, I wanted to highlight pests that have not yet been found in our region, but maybe here someday, and maybe you've heard about them. Hemlock woolly adelgid is a tiny aphid-like insect that feeds on and kills hemlock trees. It attaches to the hemlock branch and extracts nutrients and sap at the base of the needles. If there are enough insects, trees can be defoliated and eventually die. The eastern hemlock, which is the common hemlock that we see around this area, is the only native host in eastern Canada. It is an invasive species originally from Japan, and it was first discovered in North America in Virginia in the 1950s. It was detected in Ontario for the first time in 2012 in Etobicoke, and then in 2013 and 2014 near Niagara Falls. These populations thankfully were eradicated, but then in 2019, 2 small populations were confirmed near Niagara Falls, as well as Wainfleet, Ontario. Official control measures were put in place to prevent the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid into non-affested areas. And it's hard to see on this map here, but if you look at the Ontario section where my mouse is, you can see 2 little maroon detections shown in Ontario near Niagara Falls in this map. Once the young crawling insects begin feeding on the hemlock, they do not move. However, wind, birds, deer, and other wildlife can carry them to other trees and areas. Of course, they can be spread even further by nursery stock or wood products such as saw logs or firewood. Hemlock woolly adelgid usually spreads the most near lakes and streams, near bird feeders, in high traffic areas of parks, or near planted nursery stock for these reasons. In terms of identifying it on a hemlock tree, you can examine the base of the needles on the underside of the branches. So this is a photo of me near Rochester, New York, looking at a hemlock woolly adelgid on a branch. It was pretty shocking just how infected the trees were in this park. And with enough wind, it almost looked like it was snowing with the white egg sacs raining down. From November to May, but especially March to May, you can see these white woolly ovisacs or egg sacs. And the tree may also exhibit premature death or discoloration in the buds, twigs, or branches, or it could lose some of its needles. And eventually, with enough infestations, trees may die in as little as 4 years. As hemlock woolly adelgid gets closer, what can we do? We want to make sure that we are monitoring hemlock stands so we know when it gets here. We want to promote the health of hemlock to improve resilience. And because birds can spread the adelgid, it's good when hemlock woolly adelgid is here to not hang feeders near hemlock trees. Nursery stock can also be a cause of spread, so buy local trees and always inspect them first. And for individual trees, there are topical treatments or systemic insecticides that can be applied. Similar to other pests, always buy local firewood and consult a forestry professional for more information. If you do see hemlock woolly adelgid, report it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So the final invasive pest I want to discuss today is that Asian longhorn beetle. I showed you those 2 beetles earlier in the trivia. This non-native wood-boring beetle is originally from China and Korea. It mainly attacks maple trees, but it will attack other hardwoods as well. It was found near Toronto in 2003 and then eradicated, but then found again near Toronto and Mississauga in 2013. But it has been declared eradicated again after 5 years of surveys with no detection. So that's a good thing. It has the potential to degrade urban and natural forest ecosystems and can potentially have a pretty serious impact on our maple syrup industry as well, because it does attack maples. Larvae tunnel through the wood, and therefore larvae and pupa of the Asian longhorn beetle will only be seen when cutting into a tree. But what you might see is the Asian longhorn beetle itself. The adult is 2 to 4 centimeters long with scattered white spots on its glossy black body. It has bluish white legs and long black and white banded antennae. Although I'm hoping that I won't have to see one in real life, I have to admit that they are pretty neat looking and pretty distinctive, but they can get confused with one of our native beetles, the white-spotted Sawyer beetle. So this is the other beetle I showed in the trivia. This insect is native to North America and generally attacks over mature or dead trees after some other form of stress, such as a fire, windstorm, or forest pest. It can also be found in stacked logs. The white-spotted Sawyer has been found in Eastern Canada since 1936 and is considered a pretty normal presence here. The adults are 1 to 3 centimeters long and black, but you can tell them apart by the white spot behind the head. So I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but this is the head, and you can see a distinctive white spot just behind the head there. So the last thing I want to mention during every forest health discussion I have is please do not move firewood. This is a very common mechanism for spreading forest pests and diseases, so please buy wood close to your destination so you don't risk bringing any unwelcome hitchhikers. So thank you so much for listening today, and I will pass it back to Katrina.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Margaret. That was fantastic. There's so much great information in that presentation. I also want to mention that Margaret has very generously done a number of webinars in the past for us as well. So if this is forest pests, if that's a topic that you're really interested in, we do have other recordings from previous webinars on our YouTube channel as well. We'll jump to the first question here. Are there forest tent caterpillars on the Archipelago Islands? I've only ever seen the eastern tent caterpillar. I'm not sure if you're aware, Margaret, about any forest tent caterpillars on the Archipelago Islands.
I'm not sure specifically. I can go back to that map and see if we can take a look. So that's the, oh no.
It's probably the very first one.
Yeah, the first.
Yeah.
Let's look at when it was more common. Yeah. So I'm not seeing. The unfortunate thing to remember is this is moderate to severe defoliation and it's mapped. So just because it's not on this map, it doesn't mean it isn't somewhere. There could be a small population that's not causing big defoliation. And even though we have these outbreaks, it doesn't mean that, the tent caterpillar isn't going to have small populations throughout that entire time. So it's possible, but to be honest with you, I'm not totally sure if it's there or not.
Right. A bit of a follow-up question to this. These maps that you've shown here, do you know how they go about producing that information? Like what sort of surveys are done?
Yeah, I believe a lot of the surveys are done by air, but I know they also do ground surveys as well. It would probably depend on the pest and how widespread the defoliation is. But I'm certainly happy to follow up with the MNRF and get kind of some more information on specifically how they produce the maps and kind of where different surveys were done. And I can definitely share that with you with the resources afterwards.
Right. Another thing I noticed from these maps, and it's a question that I had, it seems both with this forest tent caterpillar, but I think also the gypsy moth defoliation, there seems to be quite severe defoliation north of Kingston. Is there something about that area that makes it more susceptible to these pests?
Not specifically that I'm aware of. And as we saw in the gypsy moth, it's even though like we had that bad period with forest tent caterpillar and that bad period in 2020 with gypsy moth, you can see that, sorry to flip through all these slides so quickly, it did start in southern region and there was very little up in that area before then. So I'm not aware of something that would specifically make that kind of an outbreak area and more ideal, but it's certainly not hit by it harder than other regions every year.
Right. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A. I know I have a few more, so something I just wanted to reiterate from what you were talking about. I was very interested to hear that between the forest tent caterpillar and the eastern tent caterpillar, correct me if I'm wrong, it's only the eastern tent caterpillar that actually forms those tents that we would see all over the trees?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you think of a tent caterpillar, you see tents, but no, not the case. Forest tent caterpillars kind of create these mats and form together. So you see kind of these big groups of forest tent caterpillars, but you don't see those silken tents themselves.
Very neat. What else did I have? Do you think there'll be, or I guess I should say, how do you think climate change will impact these outbreak cycles or the spread of some of these other invasives that you mentioned aren't here yet, but we're keeping an eye on? Do you have any sense of how climate change may affect that?
Yeah, so for some pests, there's definitely the concern that temperature can limit their range. And so climate change obviously may impact where they will go in terms of range because they're able to survive further north. However, the other thing to mention is in climate change, we do expect to see more severe weather, and we'll have more severe kind of weather patterns. So even though overall we may see temperature increase over time, we may have kind of extreme cold snaps or extreme weather events that may also kind of be detrimental to those populations. So, and same thing if we talk about kind of gypsy moth, it's cold tolerant down to minus 25 degrees Celsius about. So as things warm, we may see less death in those egg masses and things like that. But severe weather, may result in kind of wet springs if we have like kind of a really rainy, flooded season. And that's going to be beneficial for the virus and the fungus. So it kind of is going to depend on the pest, the natural controls, and then what kind of, beyond just kind of the general climate trends, what are those isolated weather events that we're getting that may impact them year to year?
Right, it's definitely a number of factors going into that. Just to follow up on that point that you mentioned about cold tolerant to minus 25, is that like sustained temperatures of below minus 25, or does it mean that if we get down to that temperature, that the eggs simply wouldn't survive after, say, even one or a couple nights of that low temperature?
Yeah, I'm not sure how long that temperature has to be sustained for. I know that whether they're below the snow line or not means that they can tolerate slightly colder temperatures. But I can definitely get a better answer for how long they can survive those colder temperatures and get you a better answer on that.
We've got another question here from the audience. Wondering a little bit about the economic costs associated with invasive species in Ontario or Parry Sound more generally. Can you speak at all to economic costs of forest pests?
I can't, I certainly don't have specific numbers.
Yeah.
A lot of these pests, are very concerning on individual properties, but thankfully, up until now, have not had a huge impact on some of like when you look at kind of a landscape scale. Thankfully, with biodiversity, there are things like beech bark disease that we are seeing kind of be quite effective on a landscape scale, and that is having economic issues. We are, beech quality and harvesting, as well as we're having to do control measures to kind of get other species to come back to improve the forest over time. But going forward, it will be interesting to see what the aftermath forest looks like in terms of economics. I'm not sure I could put a specific number or anything like that on it. And as we get as gypsy moth spreads this year and emerald ash borer comes into this region, certainly we're going to see more impacts of that.
In a dry spring like we're having right now, would it help to spray trees with water, i.e. keeping things wet?
Yeah, for sure. So anything you can do to kind of improve the health and reduce the stress on your trees is going to help. So yeah, if during really dry periods, you can keep your tree hydrated and make sure it has as few stresses as possible outside of the invasive pest itself. That's going to be really helpful.
Great. Which of the invasive species are you most concerned about for our region?
So if we're talking about in the future, some of the ones that aren't here yet are certainly concerning. So Hemlock woolly adelgid is definitely a concern for me, as well as Asian longhorn beetle. Thankfully, neither one of them have been found near here. So hopefully that's not a concern we have to worry about for a while. Just on a personal level, I have an ash tree in my backyard. So, oh, sorry, we just have a train passing. I have an ash tree in my backyard, so that's definitely something that I'll be watching going forward. But I know for folks that have oak trees and or other trees that have been infested with gypsy moth, that's a big concern this year. So yeah, but I would say the most concerning for me right now are those ones that aren't here yet, and then beech bark disease, because it is affecting us kind of on that landscape scale.
If we find an invasive species infestation, who should we contact to help deal with the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be a few different organizations that you can talk to. If it's a species that's regulated by the Canadian Forest Inspection Agency, you can definitely report it to them. There's also the, let me just 1 second. There's the Invasive Species Center, the Ontario Invasive Species Center, that may also be able to provide information. And then finally, if it's something like emerald ash borer or something like that, conservation authorities and municipalities have also been working with folks on street trees and private trees to kind of deal with infestations. Locally, probably not as much, just because it's we don't have the same level of infestation that we see further south. But I know kind of the Municipality of York, City of Toronto, those regions further south, the municipality itself has also been working with folks on how to deal with it. So in the resources afterwards, I'm happy to provide a list of kind of different places to turn to. But obviously, if you can find a local resource, that's always great, because they're going to know what applies to you.